Welcome back to algebra. This is your fifth to last lesson, so you'll have 4 more lessons after this, and then you will be done with Algebra 1. So in this lesson, we are going to review writing equations, and we're connecting it with slope-intercept form. So when we first learned about writing equations, we weren't focused on which variables we were using so much. We were mainly focused on making sense of the words and putting it into an equation, which is just a math sentence. Now that we know a little bit more about the slope-intercept form, a more formal way of writing these equations, I want to make sure we connect the two concepts. So y equals mx plus b is the slope-intercept form, and it's going to be the form that we often write equations in, but not exclusively. For these equations, we're going to write it in this form. The y is your output. We learned that with functions. Most often, you're going to read this as the total. In a word problem, your slope, which we denote as m, is often going to be the pattern or the rate of change, the thing that's happening over and over again in it. Like it's raining 3 inches, or somebody can do something every 2 minutes. That's going to be your slope or your m. Your x is your input. So it's often the thing that is time. So it'll be like the months or the minutes or the books, but it's going to be something very specific. And then the last part, the y-intercept, is more often the starting amount or the initial fee, whatever they start with. Something that happens only once and is at the very beginning. So we're going to be writing equations in this form. In the first example, they're going to tell you the y and the x. In the next example, they're going to change the variables. And then you're going to be able to define your own variables. And the idea is just to get used to how we can write an equation in the way that makes sense to us and then put it into slope-intercept form if we need to graph it, okay? So here are the 5 examples that we're going to do together right now. And the first column asks you to write the equation, and then the second column is asking you to identify the slope and the y-intercept for the equation you just wrote. So this goes with this goes with this, etc. All right, so in this first one, we're told each college textbook costs about $115. Write an equation for how much money Lanissa will spend, y, if she buys X books. All right, so y is money. So we're going to start with y as like the total amount of money. We know she is buying X number of books, and we know each of those books costs $115. So that means 115 times X will give us how much money she's going to spend. So looking at this is our equation. We have an equal sign. It now asks us what's our slope and what's our y-intercept. So our slope is, remember, the letter m, and it's what's next to our x. So what's next to our x is 115. Our y-intercept would be the plus b part. Since we don't have plus anything or minus anything, that means our y-intercept has to be 0. And that makes sense in this case because there's no starting amount. It's not like she's already spent this much money and she's spending even more. All right, let's try another. Jashawn has a bank account with $7,246 in it. His rent is $525 a month. Write an equation T for how much money would be in his account if he paid M months of rent. All right, so this time we have T and M as our variables. So he starts with $7,246. So I'm going to go ahead and write that part first, $7,246. And his rent is $525 a month. So I want to know how much money would be in his account, that's T, if he paid M months of rent. So here's a starting amount. When he pays the money, it's going away. It's being subtracted. So I'm going to put minus, and what's being subtracted is $525 each month. But I don't know how many months, so I'm going to put M. Whatever's left will be equal to T, how much money is still in his account. So looking at the equation I've written, it doesn't exactly follow this y equals mx plus b form. So to get it into this form, I'm first going to identify my slope and my y-intercept, and then I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it so that it matches this form exactly. So my slope, we said, would be the pattern, the thing that's happening over and over again. And what's happening over and over again is that he's subtracting $525 a month. And I need to know that it's subtracting because that means the amount is going down. So I'm going to say negative 525 is my slope. And my y-intercept, I said, was my initial amount, the starting point. So he started with $7,246. Now notice I didn't put any dollar signs in here. It gets really confusing when you're looking at an equation if you have extra symbols. So when we write equations, we only use numbers and mathematical symbols. We don't use dollar signs or degrees or anything else. All right, so if that's my slope and my y-intercept, y equals mx plus b is how I would write it. So the equal part, I want right here, and instead of t, well, I can write t, but then later I'll change it to y. T equals, and I need my slope. My slope is negative 525. I put my m next to it, plus 7,246. So now it looks almost exactly like y equals mx plus b. To make it match with the correct variables, it would look like this. So one thing a lot of people might ask is how come there's a plus here when there was a subtraction sign in our original equation? So the plus here means this amount is positive. And that makes sense because this is how much money he has. This is positive money. But what he's doing with that positive money is taking away this much for rent each month. So the part that's negative is the rent because that's coming out of the positive amount. So when I rewrote it, I kept that because remember, subtracting is like saying adding a negative. So the part that's negative is still negative in my final equation, and the part that is positive is denoted as positive with the plus sign. That's why there's a plus here, but over here we had a subtraction sign. You have to be careful when you rewrite to make sure you're carrying your negatives with the correct numbers. All right, so let's try another one. A rain gauge started with 3 inches of rain in it, and it's now raining at a constant rate of 2 inches an hour. Write an equation for the total amount of rain. Define your variables. So it didn't tell us what variables to use. So I'm going to make T equal the total amount of rain. And since I have this constant rate of 2 inches an hour, the thing that matters is H, the number of hours. This is what I mean by define your variables. Tell me what your letters stand for. So I know that the total is going to equal what it started with. And it started with 3 inches, so I'll say 3. And now it's raining at a constant rate of 2 inches an hour. So that means it's adding 3 plus 2 inches, however many hours. So I ended up with T equals 3 plus 2H. I want to convert it into my slope-intercept form, but first let me identify my slope and my y-intercept. So my y-intercept is the starting amount. That was 3. And my slope is how it's changing, how it's going up. It's going up by 2 inches each hour. So to rewrite it as in slope-intercept form, my y, my total, is going to equal mx plus b. That's my slope. So 2x plus 3. These are now the exact same equation. This is written with different variables, t and h, and this is written in classic slope-intercept form. All right, last two. I have $600 in an account. I spend $50 at the movies each month. Write an equation for the amount of money in the account. Define your variables. All right, so I'm talking about money, and I'm talking about spending money at the movies. It's a lot of ims, but I don't want to use im because I remember that's what slope stands for over here in slope-intercept form. So let's say T for total amount of money. And then since I'm talking about movies, I'm going to say F for films, movies. Okay. So I start with $600. So my total starts with $600. If I'm spending the money, that means I am losing that money from the account. That's 50, and I do that for each movie or film, F. So I have T equals 600 minus 50F. Now to define my slope and my y-intercept, M is my slope. That's what this is asking for. And remember, my slope is the one next to the variable. It's the pattern that's happening over and over again and changing. And what that is negative 50. So I put negative 50 here. And B is my y-intercept, the starting amount, which was 600. So now that I know, I've got y equals mx plus b. And I'm actually going to erase as we go. So my m is negative 50. So I put that right here. And my b is 600. So I erase that. Put that right here. So these two equations are now the exact same, just different variables. And last, I have a worker has already packed 150 boxes. She packs boxes at a constant rate of 25 boxes every 2 hours. Write an equation for the total number of boxes she will pack. Define your variables. All right, so I'm going to use T for total again because that's a nice, easy one to use. So T equals total number of boxes. And then I'm looking at this constant rate of 25 boxes every 2 hours. So H is going to be my number of hours. Now notice they do tell me every 2 hours, but they're not saying that's how many hours she's worked. Instead, they're just saying that if, in order to pack 25 boxes, it's going to take 2 hours. So when I look at T equals, I look at this total she started with, 150. She's packing more, so that's adding to it. And she's adding 25 boxes every 2 hours. So notice this one ended up being a fraction, 25 over 2. And we're used to our slope being a fraction like that. So when I go to rewrite, notice I've changed the words a little just to get us used to using more vocabulary. Rate of change is my slope, and my slope is 25 over 2. And like we said, we're used to slope being a fraction because it makes it easy to graph. And my starting value has to be 150. So to rewrite it as y equals mx plus b, let's go ahead and erase the m first. So my slope is 25 over 2. And my y-intercept, My y-intercept would be 150, the starting value. So that's how you write an equation in slope-intercept form. Your practice looks the exact same right here. This is what your practice looks like. So I want you to try all 5 of these. Remember, this column goes with this column. And M and B are just different ways of saying slope and y-intercept. Starting value, that would be your y-intercept. Rate of change is your slope. So you should get used to hearing those words in addition to just slope and y-intercept.